All right, so you sent in a bunch of stuff about Japan, a whole stack of articles, even a YouTube video. Looks like you're already pretty interested in this topic, huh? Well, get ready because in this deep dive, we're going to uncover some stuff you might not have thought about before. We're talking about Japan's population. It's declining so fast that some experts are calling it, well, a ticking time bomb for the whole country.
Yeah, it really is fascinating because this issue, it goes way beyond just numbers. It impacts their economy, their social structures, even Japan's place globally.
You know, when I was looking at all this stuff, the term that kept popping up over and over was demographic crisis. It seems like Japan is really getting hit from both sides here. A birth rate that's plummeting, AND, a population that's rapidly
Oh,
aging.
exactly. It's a double whammy. And get this, last year alone, Japan had more than twice as many deaths as births. In a country of 125 million people, they only had a little over 728,000 babies born. That's the lowest number ever recorded.
Wow, those are some serious numbers. And what's really crazy is that Japan isn't alone in this. A lot of developed countries are seeing similar trends, maybe not as extreme, but still.
Right. And that's why it's so important to understand what's causing this in Japan. It could give us a glimpse into what other countries might face, even our own country. One of the most interesting historical factors is what happened after World War II. The U.S. encouraged Japan to use birth control back then. They were worried about resources being scarce.
It's wild how policies from way back then can have these consequences that no one expected. Talk about a historical paradox. But it seems like things have changed a lot since then. Moving to cities seems like that played a big role too. I read that 92% of Japan's population lives in cities.
Wow. Yeah, and think about what that means. The cost of living is crazy high. Tiny apartments, everyone working these super long hours. It's not exactly the best place to raise a family. Take Tokyo, for example. It's one of the most crowded cities in the world. Over 16,000 people packed into every square mile.
Oh yeah, I've seen pictures of the crowds there. I can't even imagine living like that. No wonder their birth rate is so low, just barely over one child per woman.
You get it, the environment shapes our choices. And in Japan's big cities, that environment is tough for families.
And then there's the big one, the thing that everyone talks about when it comes to Japan, their work culture. I mean, they even have a word for dying from working too much. Karoshi.
Yeah, it's a dark side to that kind of work-obsessed culture for sure. And I think it's something that a lot of people can relate to, even outside of Japan.
Absolutely. Everyone feels that pressure these days. To always be on, to put work before everything else, it's like a recipe for burnout and definitely not good for starting a family.
And here's where it gets even more complicated. This extreme work culture, this economic pressure, it's directly impacting a whole generation, Japan's lost generation.
You're talking about the Gen Xers, right? The ones who grew up when Japan's economy was slowing down.
Exactly. A lot of them faced a terrible job market. Not many opportunities to get ahead. They ended up stuck in these low-paying, unstable jobs. We call them irregular workers. Guess what? They make up 40% of Japan's workforce now. These are people who are struggling just to get by, let alone afford having kids. Yeah, it's a pretty gloomy picture, isn't it? A whole generation dealing with all this economic uncertainty. And it's having ripple effects all throughout Japan.
It really makes you wonder what happens next. What are the long-term consequences of all this change in their population?
One of the most immediate things is how it affects their economy.
Yeah.
A shrinking workforce means you have fewer people working, fewer people buying things, and in the end, slower economic growth.
So it's not just about people getting older, it's about having fewer people to actually support those older folks.
Right, and on top of that slower economy, you also have a smaller tax base, and that leads to another huge problem, Japan's national debt. We're talking about a number that's so big, it would make any economist nervous over $9 trillion.
$9 trillion. That's almost impossible to even imagine. How do they manage that?
Well, for years, they've had these super low interest rates,
Yeah.
which has made it relatively cheap to deal with all that debt. But it's not a stable situation. If those rates start to go up, things could get really bad really fast.
Sounds like they're walking a tightrope. One wrong step and the whole thing could come crashing down. I bet that puts a lot of pressure on the government to find some solutions.
Absolutely, and they've been looking at all sorts of things, encouraging immigration, trying to get people to have more babies, even looking at how technology could help fill the gaps.
You know, all this talk about Japan's problems makes me think of those sci-fi movies, where robots do all the work. Do you think Japan could actually make that happen? I mean, they're known for being super innovative with technology.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Robots taking care of the elderly, keeping the economy going, maybe even freeing up humans to do more creative stuff.
You know what? Having a robot to do all the boring chores sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah.
But seriously, how realistic is that?
Well, Japan is already a world leader in robotics, especially for things like elder care and factories. So in a way, they're already moving towards a more automated future.
So maybe we won't have robot butlers serving us tea anytime soon. But it sounds like technology could really play a role in solving these problems.
Exactly. And the really cool thing is that other countries could learn from what Japan is doing. Imagine if we could use technology to help us deal with aging populations, not just in Japan, but all over the world.
That would be a game changer. It makes you think about the future of work and technology's role in society, even what it means to be human.
For sure. But while robots might be a big part of the future, we can't forget about the solutions Japan is trying right now.
You mean like immigration and those policies to get people to have more babies?
Exactly. For decades, Japan had really strict rules about immigration. It was tough for foreigners to get visas or even just visit.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. Japan was seen as this really homogenous society, not very open to outside influences. But it sounds like that's changing.
They need workers. The labor shortages are getting so bad, they need to bring in talent from overseas.
So they're opening up their borders. But what do the Japanese people think about that? That seems like a huge cultural shift.
You know, it's surprising. Polls show that most Japanese people actually support more immigration. They see it as a way to deal with the shrinking workforce and help the economy.
That's really interesting. It seems like they're starting to realize that Japan's future depends on diversity, on welcoming people from different backgrounds. But how are they actually trying to attract these foreign workers?
Well, they're doing a few things. They're making it easier to get visas for skilled workers, creating ways for people to get permanent residency. They're even offering programs to help people learn the language and culture.
It sounds like they're really serious about making Japan a more welcoming place for foreigners. But even with more immigration, don't they still have to do something about the low birth rate?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where these pro-natalist policies come in.
Pro-natalist policies, what are those exactly?
They're basically government programs to try and get people to have more kids.
Hmm.
Think of things like financial help, cheaper childcare, longer parental leave, even social campaigns to promote the joys of family.
So they're making it easier and more affordable to have kids. Makes sense. But is it actually working? Are people having more babies because of these policies?
It's hard to say for sure. Some studies have shown a small increase in births after certain policies were put in place. But overall, the impact hasn't been that big.
Why do you think that is? If they're offering money and making childcare easier, wouldn't that be enough to convince people?
Well, it comes back to all those things we talked about before, like the cost of living is so high, the work culture is so intense, there just isn't much space, especially in the cities. It all adds up to this feeling of, well, like, they don't know what the future holds. So even with financial help, a lot of young people just aren't sure about having kids in that kind of environment.
So it's like a vicious cycle. The things that cause the low birth rate are the same things that make it hard to fix it. Japan seems like it's facing a really tough situation here.
Oh yeah, it's a super complicated challenge. And there's no easy answer. But I think what's important is that Japan is actually trying to do something about it.
Yeah.
They're not just ignoring it and hoping it goes away.
True. They're trying different things, seeing what works. Maybe some of the solutions they come up with will help other countries too.
That's what makes this so interesting. Japan is kind of like a test case for the rest of the developed world. The problems they have today are problems that a lot of countries might have in the future.
So by looking at what's happening in Japan, we can learn something about our own future. What are some of the big takeaways here? What should our listeners be thinking about?
Well, I think the first thing is that we need to be able to adapt. The world is changing all the time, and we can't just stick with the old ways of doing things. Whether it's immigration or work-life balance or technology, being willing to adapt is super important.
And that's not just about demographics, right? That's about everything. Business technology, even our personal lives.
You got it. And that leads to another important point. We need to think about this holistically. Japan's population problems aren't just about numbers. It's about society, economics, culture, all mixed together. So fixing it means looking at all those things.
So it's not just about throwing money at the problem or making one new policy. It's about creating a better environment for families, valuing work-life balance, investing in education and training for the future.
Exactly. And lastly, I think this shows us how connected the world really is. What happens in one country like Japan can actually affect the whole world. We're all in this together. And to solve these big problems, we need to work together. We need to understand each other.
That's a really important message. This deep dive into Japan has been incredible. It's shown us that these issues are way more complex than they seem.
Absolutely. And while it's a serious situation, I think there's reason to be hopeful, too. Japan is facing its problems head on. They're coming up with new ideas. And that's something the rest of the world can learn from.
Yeah. It just goes to show you, even when things seem impossible, we can make a difference if we're willing to work together and be creative. Maybe by understanding what's happening in Japan, we can help create a better future for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This deep dive has been amazing. I hope our listeners learned as much as I did.
And that's it for our deep dive into Japan's demographic crisis. There's so much more we could talk about, but hopefully this gave you a good overview. It's a topic that's constantly changing, so stay curious, keep learning, and keep asking questions. Until next time, keep diving deep.